Okay, on behalf of the Bloody Sunday Trust, you're all very welcome and thank you for coming. I know the sun's beautiful, so a lot of people are probably at the beach every night, but they're missing out. So we're delighted to have Dr. Bethany Rebisz over from the University of Bristol, and she's also a collaborator with the Museum of British Colonialism, so she'll be giving a talk. Just before we start, emergency exits are over there, just follow the fresh air, and please turn your phones off. So this is going to be recorded. We didn't advertise this because if you tell people they don't show up, case in point. But we will turn it off. If people aren't comfortable, if they have questions at the end, we can turn it off so that you don't have to appear in the stream basically. It'll just be the back of your head if you even. What else do I have to say? So if you just been reminded, if you haven't already, strongly encourage you to go downstairs and have a look at the Legacy of Colonialism exhibition, which ties in very nicely with Beth's talk. And also the Bloody Sunday Trust is a charity. So we have donation buckets downstairs, no pressure because we know the times are tough. But even if you can just spare like £1, it helps us to make talks like this possible and keeps it all free and very accessible so that everyone can attend. So
£100 ahead of the grand.
Yeah, we'll cap it at that. Alright, so without further ado, Dr. Bethany Rebisz. Thank you so much.
Well, firstly, just thank you so much for having me and for the invite, and especially thank you to Kira, who has moved heaven and earth to get me from Bristol all the way here, which actually getting to Bristol Airport is a nightmare, so it is actually moving heaven and earth. So thank you for that. Yeah, my name is Beth Rebisz, and I've been at the University of Bristol now for a couple of years. I'm a social historian of modern Africa, and I'm interested in gender and women's histories, but that's within the context of British counterinsurgency warfare. So I'm going to be touching on some of those longer legacies, some of those connections, and giving some of that insight into what we at the Museum of British Colonialism have been doing to kind of redress some of the narratives, especially relating to Kenya. So I want to begin today, if that moves. It might just take a second. Ooh. Oh, there we go. Oh, 1 minute. There we go. So I want to take you, start by setting the scene with a little bit of a story, and I want you to join me in a summer garden party which took place in Oxford in 2011. And these were former sort of colonial officials, children of Britain's empire essentially, celebrating the royal wedding of Wills and Kate. So amongst those attendees was Mr. and Mrs. Pettigrew Squires, and Mr. Pettigrew Squires was spouting his fury about this High Court case that's happening in London at the time. So in the trial, Kenyan elders, and you probably heard a little bit about this trial at this point, Kenyan elders were supposedly tarnishing the reputations of his former colleagues in the colony of Kenya. So he was furious that Kenyan elders were publicly accusing his former colleagues of torturing them while they worked as part of Kenyan's colonial service. Now, Mrs. Pettigrew Squires becomes quite embarrassed. He's given this really big negative lecture at this meant to be very happy celebration event. So she tries to distract everyone, and she interjects to discuss the marvels of her life in Kenya, as she would have called it. So she describes the lavish parties they hosted, the spacious home they enjoyed, the sunshine, the land. But after distracting the other guests from her husband's negative lecture, she makes a rather intriguing omission. Now, unbeknownst to her completely of the sheer significance of this, her claim she made was telling other guests of the story when she worked as a clerk at the Nairobi's government house in Kenya in the year 1963. And on the eve of Kenyan independence, she recalls taking bundles of documents onto the governor's lawns, stuffing them into a fire pit. So she laughs and she explains the fires never ended. Now she was trying to tell a story to kind of amuse the other guests, to distract them. But more importantly, she had just confirmed that Britain had busily destroyed the archive of their misadventures in Kenya during the 1950s. So the bonfire really signified an effort to edit, to sanitize, to censor history, essentially. So just like Mr. Pettigrew's squires, the British late colonial state in Kenya was deeply concerned with reputations. And in Kenya, British colonial officials had very good reasons to fear that their reputation might be sullied. Because a violent insurrection, the Mau Mau Rebellion, had been put down during the 1950s by an oppressive and heavy-handed military response. So the colonial government had militarised in this conflict. They had imprisoned more than 80,000 people without trial. They hanged over 1,000 Kenyans. They forcibly relocated around 1.2 million Kenyans into concentration camps and subjected the local people to surveillance and interrogation on a massive scale in the manner of a police state. So it became known as a dirty war, as David Anderson has called it, with many excesses on both sides, in which Britain had been widely accused of breaking the international human rights laws in its treatment of the rebels. So the burning of these documents was an intentional act of destruction, designed to prevent these records from this campaign ever falling into the hands of the newly independent government. But Britain didn't just destroy their files via dumping them in the sea or burning them on their lawns. There was also Operation Legacy. So Operation Legacy detailed the process through which selected documents were removed from the colony and brought back to the United Kingdom secretly. Now, the Covert Act denied Kenyans of ever really being able to form a full history of what happened, any of the colonial state policies and whatnot, and it ensured that no post-colonial state could assemble a full record of this period. Now, most importantly for the British, it meant that they were guiltily guarding the secret of these files from the past. Now, the British public, including myself, knew nothing about this until the spring of 2011, unless people were already sort of connected in the networks. And it was actually the time I was picking my undergraduate dissertation as a history student, so it was sort of the end of my second year, and I was trying to work out what I wanted to do for my dissertation. So I went up to the court and I sat in the public gallery and just listened to some of the hearings. So the High Court case brought by the veterans of the Mau Mau Rebellion was seeking compensation from the British government, but mainly acknowledgement of what had happened during the 1950s. So 4 claimants were selected to share their testimonies, and they flew over from Kenya to essentially put the entire reputation of the British Empire on trial. Now, in attending some of this court, I saw two of the Kenyans that came in to speak, the claimants. But in total, there was Wambugu Wanyingi, Jane Muthoni Mara, Paolo Nzili, and Ndika Mutua. And they were very old, very frail at this point, and sort of shuffling in to give their accounts of what happened to them during the war. Now, this court case revealed, beyond reasonable doubt, Britain's widespread abuse and torture of Kenyan men, women, and children during the 1950s conflict. It also proved that the UK government had actively sought to suppress these files from ever coming to light. And I've included a quote here from the most senior lawmaker, well, law enforcer in Kenya during Britain's rule there. "If we're going to sin, we must sin quietly." This was part of the policy from the start. It wasn't sort of a panic in 1963, what do we do with these files? So one of the first questions I guess I want to address is, why was Britain in Kenya in the first place, and sort of what was this colonial experience like? I don't know how much everyone knows about different things, so I'll try not to go too deep into anyway, but try to give you an overview of this. But as many of you will already be aware, the vast continent of Africa was nearly wholly colonised by the end of the 19th century. So the process is now more commonly referred to as the Scramble for Africa. And between 1884 and 1885, at the Berlin Conference, European leaders essentially set up to discuss how they were to carve up this continent and colonise this land. And while Africa was the main agenda point of this meeting, not a single African leader was invited to the conference, and that's a really important part of this. So this was really a decision made by imperial European politicians, including Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. So why did European powers seek to colonise Africa in the 1880s? Well, historians presented three main arguments for this. Firstly, the economic argument that there was paramount importance to European leaders for the raw materials that they could gain from this territory, protecting their sort of water routes and all these sorts of things. And the historians within this camp sort of contend that the scramble for Africa was possible at the end of the 19th century, having gone through the Industrial Revolution and the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, another technological advancement which really helped the colonisation of Africa was the introduction of the rifle. This actually meant that fewer white folk could go to the places in which they wanted to colonise and overpower larger populations of indigenous people who did not have this kind of weaponry. Now, secondly, historians have shown it's the political power. Competition was at the forefront of this process. But finally, more recently, historians are really delving more into that cultural argument. So I guess we've all heard now the phrase the civilizing mission, but this real effort and this real belief white Europeans propagated in ideas which were really rooted in scientific racism. So the belief that white people were scientifically and biologically more advanced than their black counterparts was really prevalent in this racial discourse. And I always bring up Kipling's The White Man's Burden at this point, one of his most famous poems, aside from his work such as The Jungle Book. And I think this sort of stanza really kind of encapsulates some of that cultural argument that take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed. So these are the Oxbridge-educated young men who were sent out to build the colonial administrations. Your new court sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This idea that the people that they were going to encounter were deviant, uncontrollable, force was necessary and justified for that reason, but half child, the real paternalism of empire sort of coming through. So once colonised, colonial officials created borders, they grouped indigenous people together into so-called tribes, a process which was based on a lot of cultural ignorance in terms of the differences between ethnic groups. And set up their own colonial administrations through indirect rule, so the colony could function separately from the metropole. So looking at colonial Kenya more closely, situated in British East Africa at this time, I've had the immense privilege of researching this era in Kenya for the last decade now, which is horrible to think about because that means I'm getting older every year. And as many of you may already know, this is a particularly unique case study among Africanists to study British brutality within its empire. But I'll just sort of begin with this sort of early historical context before I move into the Mau Mau. And so in 1888, the British East Africa Company arrived in Kenya and established direct rule through the East African Protectorate. And that was on the 1st of July 1895. And they basically opened up the fertile highlands to white settlers. And this was to stimulate agricultural production. Now, there were two main clans in pre-colonial Kenya, so the Maasai, that I think everyone is probably much more familiar with due to the sort of tourism industry in Kenya today, and the Gikuyu. And it was the Gikuyu country which was the sort of area opened up for white settlers, this fertile highlands. Now, it was to be developed as the white man's country, forcing indigenous off the best land. But the most important step taken by the colonial state to really demonstrate its commitment to European settlement there was to essentially the alienation of African land. So they made Africans tenants on their own land and gave themselves the authority to sort of lease out that land to white settlers as opposed to indigenous Africans. Now, maybe somewhat unsurprisingly, with the freedom to live as human beings being heavily controlled, measured by the colonial state, the African population now having limited opportunity for political representation, legislation that impacted marriage rights, reproductive rights, The judicial system, which was heavily punitive, capital punishment playing a really prominent role within this, and the introduction of a prison system, which didn't exist in Kenya prior to colonialism. Resistance therefore grew amongst Kenyans. And it was largely the Kikuyu ethnic group who had been most obviously marginalised by their colonial occupiers. That is not to say that other groups across the country and the region were not, but it was mainly the Kikuyus who sort of started up this rebellion. Now, as they were calling for the return of their land and their country's freedom, they called themselves the Land and Freedom Army, and this has become more popularly known as the Mau Mau. Now, there have been previous instances of violent resistance to colonialism in Kenya, but the Mau Mau was the most prolonged period of this. And from the 1930s, resistance to colonialism became more organised around a want for political representation amongst the African population and their land rights. And this was really accelerated in the post-World War II era, where so many colonised people had been, well, forcibly conscripted into the army to fight for Britain and came back to very little reward. Now, the Mau Mau were made up of men, but it was also made up of women and children, as you can see by the images up there. In general, men were the fighters, children were the messengers of sort of information, intelligence, and women supplied the food, ammunition, clothing. But there is a lot of evidence now that women were fighting in the forest too. The most prominent, the most famous being Field Marshal Bethany up there on the left. I was very fortunate actually to interview Field Marshal Bethany in 2019. Bless her, she's getting very elderly now, and I think it might now be one of the last sort of recorded interviews we now have with her about her experience during the war, and you can actually listen to that on the Museum of British Colonialism website if you ever wanted to. She's pretty formidable. You can see her dreadlocks there. And that was a real sign of strength in the Mau Mau, that if you were in the forest, you grew up with dreadlocks, because the first thing they would do if you were captured was they would be shaved off. So Field Marshal Bethany was never captured. She spent the entire period of war in the forest and was never captured. So when I asked if I could take a photograph of her when we had our interview, she had a headscarf on the whole time, and she stopped me. She was like, no, don't take my headscarf off. And they were just down to the floor. And it was a real sign of power and authority for her. So it was a pretty remarkable day for me. You don't have days like that very often. But women at the time were really recognised by the British as being a cause of concern. And it's kind of been neglected in a lot of the histories about the Mau Mau. They were really seen as the backbone of the Mau Mau. And the British made a concerted effort to disrupt their involvement. So we can also see women's efforts recognised in the memorial that's now been erected in Nairobi, part of this sort of High Court case settlement. And here you can see the women sort of passing supplies to the Mau Mau fighter, and you'll see that their heads are turned from one another, and that was a clear tactic so that neither knew one another, to be able to essentially dob them in should they be tortured and arrested. So how did Britain deal with those challenging their authority? I think we all know it's probably not going to be a happy story. Britain launched a brutal and widespread campaign to bomb, to execute, and to incarcerate those suspected of being involved in the Mau Mau. And that's the really important part, those suspected of being involved in the Mau Mau. So this was essentially rounding up anyone that was Kikuyu and not a loyalist, whether there was clear enough evidence or not that they were a part of the Mau Mau. Now, during this campaign, the British killed more than 20,000 Kenyans, and this was through military operations, capital punishments. The Mau Mau have been said to have killed no more than around 5,000 people in the conflict. Now, a major characteristic of this war in particular was the pipeline. Now, the pipeline was a system and a network of detention and works camps that those suspected of being involved in the Mau Mau kind of had to move through this so-called idea of rehabilitation before they would be sort of released as a governable citizen again. But as we've now come to learn, and as the evidence clearly shows us, rehabilitation very much translated to torture, psychological warfare, and the use of forced labour. Now, in addition to those in detention, over 1 million Kenyans, mainly women and children, were forced out of their homes and placed into concentration camps. And they worked to prevent the Mau Mau fighters from accessing their supporters, who were providing food and ammunition. So your sort of classic coin tactic of separating the fish from the water, so to speak. And it's in these detention and concentration camps where the widespread human rights abuses were committed by those acting as part of the armed forces or the colonial state. And at this stage, I think it's always really important to reflect on the periodisation of this conflict. This is taking place in the 1950s, so Britain had just been involved in the Second World War, fighting fascists, committing genocide in Europe. Many of Britain's colonial subjects, some of whom were Kenyan, were fighting with the Allied troops. For Britain to really defend human rights in World War II, to go on to sign the Geneva Conventions, I think that's a important part of this, that aimed to protect human life and prevent things like this from never happening again, they then went on to commit their own human rights abuses very soon after in their colonies. So really showing a sort of hypocrisy and a disregard to their colonial subjects. So my work looks more closely at the experiences of women and girls who were forced into these concentration camps. Now, it's really difficult to find African women's voices, experiences in any archival or written sources. Most records from this era were created by Europeans, so that they could very much control the narrative through their institutions. So historians, really in their excitement in 2012 during this High Court case of these newly found archive and government records, they all kind of rushed to those files, I was one of them, rushed to these files to really see what was in them, to really get all of that clarification. But I think really what happened was many people forgot the most valuable resources to learn about the experiences of British colonialism. Were living, breathing people that were still in Kenya, having lived through this experience. So especially for Kenyan women, to talk about villagization, you cannot find any of their voices relating to this process or policy in the archives. So I sort of conducted an oral history project for my doctoral thesis, where I travelled around this sort of central area of Kenya and interviewed women that had been forcibly resettled during this time. To ensure essentially that their memories could be recorded and shared with their consent, of course. So the testimonies revealed that while Britain really proclaimed at the time that these camps were villages, they were there to protect civilians of war, this really wasn't the case at all. These were concentration camps in all but name. Now, the villagization policy was a major element of the British campaign against the Mau Mau. It was developed in 1953 and then introduced widely in 1954, and it forced mainly the Gikuyu and the Gikuyu-speaking regions of Embu and Meru into 854 different camps. Now, the vast majority of those villagized were women or their children and elders. And many colonial officials really assumed that because Gikuyu women were fueling this fight, tighter measures needed to be established to break this contact. So camps were controlled by colonial guards and African loyalists working as part of the African Home Guard. Britain frequently justified forced resettlement on humanitarian grounds. They used the legal terms and the phrasing and the discourse of humanitarianism. These were guarded settlements which would provide greater protection for civilians, where they would be, quote, less vulnerable to attack. So my work really argues that Britain deliberately sought to conceal the brutality of these spaces by calling them, first and foremost, villages. We must remember the historical context in which it's playing out. Britain has a long history of forcibly containing civilian populations. They'd initially tried and tested it in the Second South African War, and that faced heavy criticism as 50,000 civilians died in those concentration camps, mainly women and children. And the term concentration camp then takes on a really even deadlier name in that Second World War era, when European powers are sort of signing these international human rights laws, it seems to have a little bit of a military rebranding of some of these tactics. So the term village denotes an image today, especially in a British context, just as it did really in the 1950s, this sort of small rural settlement with a church, a village shop and a recreational space. And the British colonial administration sort of released images like this to really justify that and show that. So this is sort of titled in the archives as the model village. And so these pictures would have been used, that women making tea together, learning new craft skills, children playing on the slides, a lovely shop with a woman looking very cheerful to sort of to sell the goods to other people in the village. So this is a real sort of deliberate attempt to create quite a feminine view of these spaces, rather than the sort of militarised and masculinised camps that they had erected to punish Kenyan women en masse. Now, in stark comparison to the iconography presented in the villagisation scheme by the public relations team, the women I interviewed in my research characterised their surroundings as a detention camp, where they were constantly watched, where they had limited access to necessary resources, where their movement, their actions were restricted and completely controlled by guards. So the male authority informing the planning of villagisation and the architecture of these spaces really prioritised the security aspects, rather than the sort of hygiene, well-being, civilian welfare infrastructure. The priority of the government was to secure the security of the camp and form an infrastructure which connected the local affairs to the wider counterinsurgency campaign. So while euphemistic terms such as village were used to sort of occlude the violent nature of these processes in the external facing discourse, the carceral language found in the internal planning and correspondence is really evident. So camps were often enclosed by barbed wire fences, trenches, filled with sort of sharpened spikes. You would have the security post, as you see on this image, at the top of the hill for the best sort of surveillance strategy, and you'd have the houses, sort of the huts built in rows, not how the few people would have normally lived in their sort of settlement structure, in rows like this, so that the sort of eye of the state could always be on them. And one of my interview participants even described to me that when they were brought to this camp, they had to build their hut with the windows facing the security post, so the state could literally look into their homes at every stage. So that's sort of how pervasive we're looking at. And you've got drawbridges there to sort of control the movement in and out of the village, as you can see up here, and the watchtowers. So my interview participants described to me how they felt encamped by this infrastructure. When I used the term village, I slipped up once, and I used the term village because that's what I was seeing in all the files, that's kind of how my brain was sort of thinking about it at the time. I was stopped very firmly, like that was not a village, it was a camp. One interviewee expressed to me, we looked like caged people. And her words really encapsulate how this experience was embodied and internalised by many inside these spaces. The impact of forcibly controlling the movement, the activities, and the lives of those inside these camps created a detention-like environment. So in explaining that the Home Guard post was situated at the top of the hill, an interviewee said, "We see the Home Guards up there. The watchtower officers could see the entire camp." And not only did the positionality of the Home Guard watchtowers sort of enable better surveillance, it meant that it reinforced the authority on inhabitants, so they regulated their own behaviour, because they knew they were under watch. So they had to be very careful in the ways in which they communicated and interacted with one another. When I asked one interviewee why there were trenches around her camp, was that to protect you? She corrected me, no, to keep you in and to help them to contain you there. In no way did she feel like this was sort of a protection for her as a civilian. So my work really argues that the camps introduced during villagisation were spatial formations of fear and terror for those forced into them. So the intimate exploration of the suffering experienced and remembered by those who were forcibly resettled really exposes sort of how pervasive and also gendered this coercion and force was. These were camps designed and governed by men who worked for the colonial government, and the spaces were largely inhabited by women and their children. So it might have sort of projected this reformative discourse that they were protecting civilians, but the experiences and the testimonies of women tell a very different story. So starting with the initial removal of people into camps, one interviewee described being rounded up and taken while being beaten around like sheep. She had vivid memories of watching her homestead go up in flames before being forced away to this camp. And this was a form of terrorization. It showed people that they could not return home once they were taken to these spaces. Once living in the camps, women described the discriminate deployment of violence and terrorizing used against them. So one interviewee detailed the frightening experience witnessing home guards torching the roof of one hut when they suspected that there had been some sort of Mau activity happening within this hut and that they might have been aiding fighters from across the fence. She explained that it was part of persecution and to make people submissive. And they would routinely do this at about 8 o'clock at night, so people would be in their huts eating dinner, and if the wind caught at the wrong direction, then of course it would set the other houses' roofs on fire. So women got very quick to learn that as soon as they saw one hut torch, they would remove the roof of their hut and sort of move it to the bottom of the village to rebuild the next day. Now, a particular site in the camp which had a notable significance in the discussions I had with women was this security post at the top. So the post became very familiar to women and girls. Descriptions of the indaki, like a cell-like structure in the Home Guard post, emerged as a key place associated with physical violence and torture at the hands of security personnel. So screening, i.e. torture, had been a vital component in the rehabilitation process within the network of detention and works camps, but it was also happening within these so-called villages. So one of my interviewees was held at a security post and interrogated and sustained severe bodily harm in this process, and she was actually incarcerated in that post for about 6 weeks. So I want to also point out how central these security posts were, being at the top of the hill. There would have been nothing sort of discreet or quiet about someone being taken from their hut up to the security post to be disciplined. So I sort of interpret that as a deliberate strategy to sort of terrorise people within the village, of knowing if they didn't behave, so to speak, this was their fate. Sadly, rape and sexual violence was a daily threat, and it was often girls that were most vulnerable because their mothers were often forced labour within the day. So some girls were then forced to remain with their rapists and even went on to marry them if they subsequently became pregnant, so that they weren't sort of shamed within their community. So the memories of former inhabitants ascribe real deep-rooted meaning to the places that the colonial state had pictured, essentially, here. So the memories of violence embody the buildings constructed in these sites. The drawbridges literally sort of restricted their movement, the Ndaki cells imprisoned them, individual huts were set on fire and destroyed, and as the evidence really reveals, there's violence and sort of suffering pervading all spaces in these camps. I do think it's really important, though, in these discussions, that we are not always looking at this through a lens of victimhood, because despite these conditions and despite these horrific details, women and girls that I spoke to, that I've been researching for some time now, they really built communities of care among one another, and I think that's a really important point to raise. They forged friendships, they looked after one another's children, they took in orphan children whose parents might have been killed in the war. They established their own trading networks so they could undermine the authorities. They continued to support the Mau by sort of hiding some food as they went out on their forced labour and burying it somewhere. They found many different ways in which to make one another's lives easier, as well as they could within these sort of violent structures. And some women were able to really use this as an actual space where they could gain greater financial independence for themselves, because their husbands were actually in detention camps. So they were able to actually sort of learn new skills that they then went on to use in independent Kenya. So there's so many layers to these stories. I can't sort of justify it by sort of grouping them all together in a homogenous story. But a really important part of this work to me has been to disseminate this information as widely and as accessibly as possible, in light of the British government actively trying to bury the evidence from ever coming to light. So since it began, I've been working with colleagues, mainly in Kenya, through the Museum of British Colonialism, to kind of find creative ways to communicate these stories and these histories, these more marginalised narratives. And so one of our most recent projects has brought together all this evidence I've explored with you today to exhibit the history of villagisation. So we launched just last September an exhibition called Barbed Wire Villages, where we really sought to dismantle some of the myths perpetuated about these sites by using the testimonies of Kikuyu women. So you can see my artistic contribution is my bird's eye drawing to try and tell my digital experts how it would sort of look and how the camp would all be set up, while they made it into what it is, and I'll show you a video in a second. But yeah, I worked with African Digital Heritage to build sort of 3D reconstructions of these camps, because these camps don't exist today in Kenya. Some of the detention camps were repurposed because they're very well built, and they now either remain as prisons or some of them as schools, which is quite an interesting legacy of these detention camps. The villages, the so-called villages, they were so rushly built, very quickly dismantled with land redistribution after independence, so they don't really exist today. So we've kind of tried to create a 3D reconstruction of what it would look like. So I can show you a bit of that today. Let's see if it pops up. I'm actually a little slow. This is sort of the beginning stages. And here you can see the exhibition launched in Nairobi last year. So you see sort of like the individual huts and then coming up to the security post. And then the trenches that I described at the beginning there. So as I draw this to a conclusion, I want to open up some questions to reflect on the implications of this case in relation to others. If these human rights abuses were committed between 1952 and 1959, and Kenya gained its independence from Britain in 1963, why was the British government only held accountable for this in 2011? So I want to return now to that Operation Legacy, the programme I opened this talk with, which signified the British destruction of government records relating to this war in Kenya. Now, while Britain was at the height of decolonisation, they actively sought to suppress this. All secret documents from Britain's colonies were vetted by MI5 or special branch agents to ensure those that might embarrass the British government and Her Majesty the Queen, for instance some showing racial or religious bias, were destroyed or sent to the United Kingdom. The files that were secretly returned to Britain consisted of 8,800 files related to around 37 countries and territories, to do with events during the 1950s and 60s. So really precise instructions were given on the methods of destruction, burning or dumping at sea. And some of the files detailed torture methods used against opponents of the colonial administration, such as the Myanmar conflict. So after the UK government admitted in 2011 to having this secret documentation, it began to declassify documents. So by November 2013, around 20,000 have been declassified. And I think it's really important to note that the British government did not just one day decide to classify and admit to having these files. It really was because of this High Court hearing of historians, activists and survivors coming together and proving that these files existed and being able to plot their journey back to the UK. And the British government did suddenly find them. And miraculously they found them in a building in which they built to hide them, which that would have been my first place of looking. So these were found essentially the building in Hounslow Park. So I'm glad they finally dug them out. And they went on to sort of issue a statement of regret, and by mid-2013 the government agreed to pay £19.9 million in compensation to over 5,000 claimants. So it's about £2,000 to each claimant. Many of the people that received that money, they had lost limbs, had been castrated, these sorts of injuries and abuses. And many of the victims would have already passed away, because obviously this was a historic case, and I think that's important to recognise. So this case brought into question this longer history of British design environment strategies used to fight insurgency movements. And a question I always get asked, especially by my students, is, well, if the documents that are in the FCO sort of migrated archive that we can now look at, if they were so damaging about the torture method, why did the British want to keep those ones? Because they destroyed so many, why did they want to secretly remove them and bring them to the UK? It was because they wanted to know which tactics worked and were most effective, and as we know, went on to be used in other places. So they were really important documents to the British government and the British Army in their counterinsurgency doctrine and how they wrote that doctrine. The colonial sort of environment, especially in Africa, has been described by some historians as sort of the testing ground for many sort of counterinsurgency tactics that we still see being used. So thinking about these sort of longer histories, I've signposted some works in the PowerPoint which explore the historical roots and evolution of these tactics used from Malaya, colonial Malaya, to Kenya, to Northern Ireland, to Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not going to attempt to be an expert in any of these histories, because that is just not my place. I'm a historian of Kenya here and counterinsurgency there, but obviously there is this much longer history to do with these. An excited member coming in, to do with this case. But I would also argue there are strong connections between different African countries as well. These tactics were used in Zimbabwe in the 1970s. That was going to be a comparison of my PhD, but I just had too much on Kenya to look at. But Paul Dixon's work in particular really argues that Britain's approach to counterinsurgency has never been to secure the hearts and minds of the people, as it claims, but can instead be characterised by considerable degrees of coercion and abuse of human rights. As he argues, quote, to describe these campaigns as hearts and minds disguises the reality of what occurred, and because these camps were seen as these campaigns were seen as relatively successful, encourages some to argue that similar techniques should be applied to current operations. So I think it will be interesting for future historians studying the campaigns that Britain had fought in the last 30 years even, to see how these legacies have persisted. So I'll leave you on that thought, and I thank you so much for taking the time on such a hot evening to come out and talk about Kenya with me, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Any questions?
So it's quite a very Wednesday evening.
I'll get us started even. Beth, could you talk a bit about sort of healing processes in more recent years in Kenya?
Yeah, so it's Kenya's quite a tricky one in terms of mapping how that works. So I think it's really important to identify that the new government in independent Kenya from the 1960s kind of continued this legacy of suppressing the history of the Mau Mau. So Mau Mau was banned as an organisation and to be spoken about as an organisation until about like 2005. And so there was an active pursuit by the Kenyan government as well to sort of undermine what had happened. And so you had then a lot of people that fought in the Mau Mau feeling even worse betrayed in independent Kenya, because they had felt that they had fought for sort of land and freedom, that now the new government officials were getting that land and freedom. That's kind of like part of that discourse. So it's remained quite fractured. But that was partly why we sort of started the Museum of British Colonialism in Nairobi, and worked with mainly to start being an educational tool, because so my friend Chow, who is one of the co-founders of NBC, she grew up in Kenya. She loved history. She's always loved history. She never learnt about any of this growing up at school. I never learnt about any of this growing up at school, but I think that's more obvious that I wouldn't have learnt about that here in the UK. And so part of that work was to build NBC to basically build as many sort of educational resources that could be used as part of that. And then working really closely with the Mau Mau War Veterans Association, which is based up in Derry, really at the heart of where the counterinsurgency played out. And they have sort of a small museum there, which is, it used to be a native court, as it would have been called. So you literally walk in, you can see the courthouse, but it's now been turned into an exhibition of Kikuyu culture, the history of Mau Mau. And so part of our step in aiding and supporting sort of just continued discourse within this is we're taking the Barbed Wire Village exhibition up to Nyeri this summer. So I'm going to be in Kenya in August time, and just basically set up a forum in which people who participated actively in this research by sharing their testimonies and taking the time and really revisiting a lot of that trauma can kind of continue having that discussion, and to ensure that their stories are being represented in the way that they would like their stories to be represented at all times, and to feed back into any future projects. So it's kind of, it's been quite a fractured landscape in terms of healing processes, or sort of, there's not been any sort of like truth and reconciliation, like you have in South Africa. So it's sort of smaller activist networks, I would say, that have been trying to do that. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I have more of a comment than a question. The point you made about compensation.
Yes.
It's a clear example of the still existing imperialistic mentality and the colonizing mentality and the British entitlement mentality of compensating 19 million to people of the equivalent of 2,000 each.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they want the world to see themselves as being held accountable and responsible. And is there any hope of getting that mentality away from the British elite system?
I'm sure you can guess my answer on my face. I mean, I guess you're touching at the heart of what colonialism does. Colonialism is designed to be as pervasive as possible. It enters every structure, it enters every part of society. The reason prisons exist in Kenya today, using the same laws that were instigated in the colonial period, is designed in such a way that it has such a tight hold, and the mindset is there, even amongst many people that have been colonised, and I think that's an important part of it. So, in that way, no, in my eyes, I think it would take more people actually taking a long, hard look at what it means to be anti-racist, all of that, which I think are the foundations of our current political structures in many ways, I guess.
So is it intergenerational, do you think?
I think it's, yeah. I don't.
So there's little hope then, is that what you're saying?
No, I think there is a lot of hope in many ways. Consider, I think, and I can talk about it from my own perspective, I can't talk about it from other people's perspective, but I think about what I learned at school. I know that is a very small part of this, about in terms of our education, but what I learned in secondary school was my only encounter in, say, Africa was through the unit British Foreign Policy. And it was literally framed as, oh, Britain went to these places, and oh my gosh, look, we found all these things, and oh, but we gave these people jobs, and like that was really genuinely how I learned about it. And I was like, okay, weird. But that was kind of my education to it. And then I came to university, I carried on with history, I did the colonial experience in Africa as a unit, and I was like, and I felt deeply ashamed, really ashamed and very embarrassed. And really since then, it's for me been a daily unlearning and re-educating of myself, because I'm part of that system, I'm very aware of that. So in that sense, I think it's getting better when you're hearing how education is shifting, and I think that's despite the curriculum. I think that's based on individual teachers that are doing a lot to incorporate these kinds of histories into a very compact curriculum, which they have to do. So I think that's one small step that I'm seeing a lot come out of. I think it's a much bigger thing than that, so I'm not going to try and speak to all angles. So I do have hope. I like to believe in the best of people, but maybe I'm very naive, especially when I do a topic like this. I hope that there's something as a response.
Beth, you might know it, but that photograph of Civil War, that's taken just a couple of 100 yards from here.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's a Hog's Valley, just across. Sort of yeah. And
I was very excited to see that I was speaking here today.
Yeah.
Nice message.
You mentioned the East Africa company, and it obviously sounds very like the East Indian company, and I don't remember the titles, but when Ireland was colonised, I think we had similar sort of extractionist sort of companies established with long sort of purpose to basically take out as much as they could from the colonised country. So what happened? And I suppose I can guess in the answer, but I'm not sure. But what happened in Kenya specifically with regard to the political withdrawal in the early 1960s compared to the economic domination, basically, of the Kenyan country? I assume that continued?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also thinking about the context of the Commonwealth, I think that's a really important part to that story. The end of the British Empire really was then the beginning of the Commonwealth, because that was a sort of new membership for areas of the world that had been colonised by the UK, by Britain, and this really sort of helped nurture those trading networks, those economic partnerships, and to sort of extend more of the sort of development work, which the development sort of term was already kind of being used across the colonies, sort of from the post-1945 era, that now it was all about development in these places, because Britain knew it was losing its colonies, and Britain knew it was starting the process of decolonisation, so they were implementing avenues, I guess, to continue that relationship, just in a different format. So yeah, it's very much part of that. I saw a hand there.
Is it a question or not?
Someone here.
No, I'm sorry I was late, but I really enjoyed your lecture. It was really good. But I might have missed about it at the start, but I was just curious about, it was really interesting hearing about the Mau, am I saying it right? I was just curious about like the allies that we had, like groups like in Africa had. Like I'm just about to hear a wee bit more about that, and who would they be, and kind of like, you know, I seen there was a photo that I think they were armed, like different groups were armed. So I was just curious about like where that kind of network would have been and who they were, sort of.
Yeah, really fantastic question. So, in comparison to sort of, I don't know, your insurgent groups in Zimbabwe in the sort of 1970s, ZANU and ZAPU, who had that sort of external support from the Soviet Union and China, the Mau didn't have that kind of external funding and support in terms of weaponry. Most of their weapons were handmade. So by and large it was handmade weapons, handmade guns, knives, machetes. So one of the most horrific Mau attacks was the Lari massacre, in which they went to a loyalist village and they massacred them with sort of machetes. So that was, they were much more internal than some of the other sort of guerrilla movements and independent movements across the continent. And by and large that's been one of the reasons some people have argued that it wasn't as successful. Now the Mau lasted a heck of a lot longer than the British thought they were going to. So the state of emergency was declared in October 1952, and all the documentation says, like the governor saying, this is going to be over by Christmas. I mean, it wasn't over, really. They caught their last Mau Mau leader in 1956, so the Mau Mau lasted a lot longer based on their weaponry compared to the British Army, but that was due to their sort of guerrilla tactics and sort of sabotage, forest fighting. But yeah, less external support in that sense. But you did have leaders within the sort of political African groups, so the Kenya African Union, who would have had close relations to Russia with education and things like that. So there were external influences in that sense, but less practical.
There's more tying in a couple of issues. So one was the issue about the British, and as I said, they're going to have intrinsic, but I was talking to you just in the very beginning of the early summit, and I was saying to you, as somebody who works in the NHS, and you said the word pervasive, and I said that you can't get more pervasive than the NHS, because the NHS is a colonial institution. It could only ever exist on the basis of extraction, as is brought up, of labour to do jobs that people don't want to do. It's too hard, or it's too hard, it's too lazy, too stupid to do, but you want to do it at a cut price. So the easiest way to do it is to bring people in by either tempting them or forcing them. It used to be forced, still to an extent forced, and so we're still doing this to this very day. And even the trust that I work in considers this proudly that they have an international medical recruitment where they go over to countries and basically sell them a lie, bring them over here, and obviously once they're tied in here between fear of visa, hope of a better life. But it's quite interesting because one of the two first groups when the NHS formed were the Irish nurses that we were talking about going over, and the Windrush generation. And then obviously it was but it's still all stereotypes, so you didn't have Irish doctors going over, it was just the way you needed the female emotional labour, the underappreciated, and obviously the Windrush generation. And then, and each of the groups had based on their class, or whether they had the stereotyping of intelligence, or, being able to follow the master's orders, but it's still going to this very day. And the whole NHS could not even have a heartbeat if it wasn't for colonialism. It didn't come across because somebody wanted to be generous to the British public. It was generous to the white at the expense of somebody else. And the only groups that they're going to use are the ones that they ruled over. And that's how it's working. And it still is to this day. So when people say how hard is it, that's how hard it is, because people think the NHS is British. The NHS is like everything else. It's stolen from somewhere else.
And this is partly as well, a very different way, but why I banged my head against the wall when I started working at university, and we're decolonising the curriculum. We're decolonising the institution. What does that mean? Can you decolonise the colonial institution? It's diversity work, or that's really what they're doing. It's like they're trying to diversify their curriculums, and the student body. But the structures are still in place, which make it incredibly hard for marginalised students to go through the system. So there is a reason, as a historian of Africa as well, I'm the one teaching that, one of the ones teaching that at the University of Bristol. And the student body that I teach is predominantly white, middle, upper class students. It's still a very sort of privileged discipline. And we can try and teach as many different things as possible, but if we're not kind of actually really questioning the structures through which we're teaching